Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs du colloque. Je vous envoie mes meilleurs vœux pour le colloque. Mais il me faut parler en anglais, malheureusement. I'm very happy to be speaking to this colloquy. I'm very sorry not to be there in person. I want to thank Guillaume Bourgeois for the extraordinary work he has done in putting this together. My talk, which will be relatively brief, will cover simply a few points. I feel I have to explain in the first place how I came to be writing about a topic so far from my professional training, expertise, and publications history. I then want to touch on a few items in the Valtin archive that I think are especially important and that perhaps an introductory student might not be aware of from the outset. I want to continue my argument that you find in my book. It's not really an argument, it is an assumption or an implication that Out of the Night is a largely fictional work and that its author takes myriad liberties with the truth to such an extent, really, that it is difficult to regard it as a serious historical document. And finally, I'm going to propose 3 or 4 topics for possible research. Now, I am a professor of medieval literature at Princeton University. I've now been retired for about 12 years. But I have some other interests. You see part of my workshop here, which is my library and press shop, from which I issue such reactionary screeds as the one with which you're probably familiar. But I also am a bookbinder, and bookbinding is what led me to Jan Valtin. I have to pause there to say that I don't really know how to pronounce his extraordinarily made-up name. I'm calling him Jan Valtin in an American way rather than Jan Valtin in a pseudo-European way. Well, anyway, many years ago, binder's board, I have a piece of it here in my hand. It's the main material in bookbinding. You make the covers of the books from it. Started to become very expensive. And as a cheapskate, I found a secondhand bookstore in a nearby village where they simply threw out the old books and you could buy a very large bag full of these books for $1. I would go over there and buy the largest ones I could have, strip them, and use their parts in a new bookbinding. Now, for some reason that I cannot explain, I picked up not this book, but actually the bigger original edition of it there. And instead of simply tearing it apart, I started reading it. And once I got to the first paragraph, I couldn't put it down. I'm a German by birth, so forth and so on. My voyage began at the point where the Rhine suddenly sweeps westward to bite its course through the mountains before it curves north again to flow broad and swift past the Lorelei and the towers of Cologne. I thought that was pretty good writing and rather ambitious writing, and I soon was into the plot. A plot that you know very well indeed. When I finished reading that book, I thought, I've never heard of this writer. I've never heard of this book. How can that possibly be? I'm a professor of literature. I was especially embarrassed when I discovered that it was the best-selling book in the United States in the year 1941, a crucial year, right on the cusp of the war. So I went over to our library, the university library, to see if there were any other books by this author, Jan Valtin. Well, there were. They all turned out to be rather mediocre in my view, nothing like Out of the Night. But much to my amazement, I discovered that within recent weeks, the university had accessed a complete archive of his original materials in more than 20 document boxes. I won't go into how this happened to come to Princeton from the Historical Society of Maryland, where it had been placed. Well, now I want to explain how I got into the meat of the topic. Since I had looked at this archive, I was asked by the librarians to write an essay for the Chronicle of the Princeton University Library. And it is this. It is the, quote, truth about Jan Valtin. Now, I give you a bit of my own bibliography because this has appeared nowhere else, and it's in a rather obscure publication. It is in volume 67 of the Princeton University Library Chronicle, volume 67 for 19205 and 206. And in it, I tell about my discovery of this author, my discovery. Other people obviously knew him already, but it contains some information that is not in my book, The Anti-Communist Manifestos, about which I have to say this. When I retired 12 years ago, I had the mad thought that unlike all the other 10 or 12 books that I'd written, I might be able now, on technical medieval subjects, I might be able to write a book that would make me some money, a trade book in New York. It's an amusing story how all that worked out, but I got a major publisher, Norton, to publish the Anti-Communist Manifestos, which I intended as a work for a general reader. It does not have footnotes. It does not have much by way of bibliography. I rather regret that now because people have been able to say, "Oh, I don't know, where did he get this from?" It is pretty deeply researched because I sat down and read a whole library of political works from the 1930s and 40s. So the first document I would mention is the truth about Jan Valtin. Now, a second document, which I suppose most researchers have found, but if you haven't, it's absolutely indispensable, is a detailed chronology that the author made out at the instructions of the FBI to give a detailed month by month, and if possible week by week, account of his activities in the United States between 1938 and 1941. Now, I found this in the archive of Isaac Don Levine in Emory University in Atlanta. I'm going to have a little more to say about Levine later. But in a letter from Ellis Island, March 15th, 1943, I think Eric will be interested in this paragraph. He's writing to his friend Don Levine. "The other day, through deduction, I came to a curious conclusion. I had a pack of letters written by Firali, that is Hermione Stover, his first wife, written by her to me, letters of love and of dying hope. One day these letters were stolen. In March 1941, a man named Kallenberg tried to sell a batch of letters, quote, about Valtin, to editor Henderson at Reader's Digest. Henderson declined, but later the stolen letters were sold or given to the same firm. I forget its name, which bought Nelson's excellent pamphlet library. Someday, I think, I'll go and get them back. Strange world. Well, those are letters, Eric, that you would certainly, I think, want to see. And since they have to do with his life in Germany, any scholar of Krebs would be interested. This is what the document looks like. It is very detailed, as I say, month by month, sometimes week by week. So that is an important document. Now, the whole question of the, quote, truth of Valtin's book continues to be disputed. And in some of the recent conversations I've had with people, I discover there are people who put more trust in the author than I do. There is in the archive in Princeton, it's in box 8, a particularly important letter from Chester Williams. It's a 3-page typed letter, and a very long letter. This letter, well, Williams was a New Deal bureaucrat. Krebs hung out with a lot of New Deal bureaucrats, including his close friend Dorothy Donnell, the screenwriter would-be. And Donnelly was a great friend of Chester Williams, who was an expert in public relations. And Krebs wrote to him and said, what can I do, to improve my image? And the answer is extremely interesting. He says, really, nobody believes this book. And most Americans are shocked by its sexual content. Now, that may seem very strange, will seem very strange to us, where we are now in the 21st century. But the advice that Williams gave was that Americans not merely didn't believe the book, but they thought that the author of it was a sexual braggart and a cad. I mention this as one of several factors about the book which do not contribute to your purpose of being accepted as a sincere collaborator with honest Democrats in the struggle to frustrate the designs of dictatorships. Now, of course, it was very important for Krebs that he be seen in exactly that context. It was partly on the basis of this letter that he wrote his amazing essay, American Dawn, which practically everybody in America read, and which converted many of them, I think, to his cause. Maybe the most devastating single document that I have come across, though, I do mention it in the in the book, is in Look magazine for May 20th, 1941. That happened to be my 5th birthday, incidentally. And in this, Look, like all the other magazines, had made much out of the night. And in it, there is a letter from a reader with a picture attached, and the picture is of a communist meeting in Hamburg in 1932, in which Krebs is prominent. He's right here, as a matter of fact. Now, the author of this letter is a man named Morris Appleman. He appears as a character in Out of the Night under the name Mike Pell, which probably was his communist name when he was working in the labor unions in Germany. But here is what he's rather irate because he's been misrepresented. As an adventure story, he says, Out of the Night is a thriller. As an autobiography, it must be taken with a grain of salt. As a historical document, it must be ruled out. Some of the events I have checked against my personal experience. For other discrepancies, I do not ask the reader to take my word. I merely cite contradictions from the book itself. And he does then list a number of contradictions, which in my reading of the book I had not picked up. But he obviously thinks that Valtin is a poser, that he is presenting a fiction as though it were a true autobiography. And I explain in my book my interpretation of why he had to do that, or he felt that he had to do it. And once having made that decision, they were, of course, stuck with it. Now, there is another letter. I don't publish it in full in my book, but I find it extremely important. It is in the Valtin archive in Princeton. It is from a literary agent whose name is Fierst, F-I-E-R-S-T. As he was trying to make as much money out of his book, I think he was approaching an end of the writing. Krebs, although he was by contract obliged to work through his agent, that is to say, Levine, he paid no attention to that. And he simply went to New York and knocked on the doors of various agents. And with one of them, this Fierst, he had a pretty significant conversation. The two of them talked at length about the point of view of the novel. I'm using point of view here in a technical literary sense. That is, from what point of view is the story told? Indeed, I think that this book needs to be studied, first of all, as a work of literature, and only secondly, as an historical document. And they had a bit of a difference in point of view. Krebs, according to this letter, thought it ought to be in the third person. That is to say, the normal voice of historical fiction. Fierst said, it would really spice this up if you had a first-person narrator, which of course moves it toward the autobiographical. Now, between them, the letter from Fierst and the letter in Look magazine that I just read you seemed to me to put beyond question the fictionality of Out of the Night. Now, the degree to which it is fictional is, of course, up to debate. I don't have Fierst's letter, but I discuss it on page 123, very easy to remember, 123 of the Anti-Communist Manifestos. Now, I want to end this by suggesting a few areas that I think are extremely important for further research. The first involves the still mysterious figure to me of Robert Beck Grand. of Stamford, Connecticut. I mean, originally, of course, a German radical, a man who had helped Krebs and other refugees from the German merchant marine, and about whom I was able to find out not a very great deal. But we do know from this chronology that Krebs came up with that between February the 4th and June 30th, this would be of 1940, he was living with Ben Beckran and writing his book. Beckran was the center of a kind of group of radical Germans, many of them communists or ex-communists, who deserve more attention than I was able to give them. Now, I told you I'm a literature professor, and I want to raise another literary issue. There is a classic work, mystery work of 20th century literature by B. Traven, a pseudonym, the pseudonym of an almost certainly German novelist who was living and writing in Mexico. He wrote a book called Death Ship, published in Germany in 1926 and brought out in America in 1934, which is among the underground classics of left-wing American literature. His best-known work was a novel called The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, out of which John Huston and Humphrey Bogart made a terrific movie, a movie that won many Oscars, as a matter of fact. Repeatedly, it has been suggested that there is a connection between Krebs and this unknown writer, B. Traven. Now, if Krebs wrote The Death Ship, he did it when he was 10 or 11 years old, so I think that that is unlikely. But there do seem to me to be textual filiations between Out of the Night and the Death Ship. So there is a third topic that I think very much deserves attention. And this is the life and career of Krebs's friend and collaborator and editor, Isaac Don Levine, who lived from 1892 to 1981. Now, Levine was one of the great anti-communist busybodies of the 20th century. He had his finger in almost every major international incident relevant to this topic. The mysterious death of General Krivitsky, for example, was one of these that he was associated with. He was a conduit for Whittaker Chambers, as Chambers began to write his great book, Witness. He was in all sorts of pies. In fact, he was still around at the time of the Kennedy assassination, and since he was a native speaker of Russian, he sort of got a unique and exclusive in with Marina Oswald, the widow of the assassin of Kennedy. Now, unfortunately, he is so loathed by people on the left, it was in his time, that his great contributions, intellectual contributions, along with those, I have to say, of Eugene Lyons, for example, or Max Eastman, in fact, anybody who was a communist apostate was likely to be pretty well blackballed by the American literary establishment. And for this reason, the extraordinary importance of Levine as a generator of information, perhaps misinformation, propaganda, certainly anti-communist information, has been very sadly neglected. Now, I have to say that it was the I'm not a political person much, and I was amazed and appalled to discover the degree to which the political passions of the 1930s had so distorted the historical, the literary history of that decade. And of all the people that people love to hate, Isaac Don Levine was among the most hated. He has a very rich archive that is in the Jewish Studies section of the library at Emory University in Atlanta. Among other things, there is an unpublished and unexamined, as far as I know, manuscript of a novel by Krebs there, the one that he tried to write and went nowhere, and Eugene Lyons had to tell him it was unsaleable before he met the people who set him onto his great book, Out of the Night. It's partly in reaction to the extreme left-wing bias in what I will call standard American literary history that I tried to counter it with counterblasts of a semi-amusing nature, I hope, in my own book. In any event, this man, Richard Krebs, Jan Valtin, remains an extraordinary mystery to me. He's been greatly humanized by his son Eric Krebs, reading his letters to his wife, but I doubt that much of the so-called truth about him is at all recoverable now. But even in that mystery, even in that contradiction, it seems to me we have a kind of summary of the political passions of the late 30s into the early 40s of the World War, which then went on to create the Cold War, and which have created the uneasy world in which we live today. So I want to wish you very well with your colloquy. I will look forward to seeing whatever written results there are. I'm always happy to hear from any students or readers of Valtin. My email is jfleming@princeton.edu. Now I'm going to say goodbye to you and wish you a very stimulating discourse among yourselves. Thank you for letting me join the colloquy in this indirect way.